So, this is our research team. You'll recognize two of us, Cheyenne, Mark, Matt here. So we, as the research team, are working on both Objective 2 and 3. I'll cover Objective 2, which is build and disseminate evidence for the field. Ash will cover 3, which is more about M&E. So we're working on 3 main activities under Objective 2. And I will go through each pretty quickly, and we'll have time to talk about them. So Activity 2.1, develop reference documents and M&E tools related to safer learning environments, which we've referred to as school safety, but we're expanding it to learning environments to imply it doesn't have to be a school. It should be a place where you learn. So the last few months, we've basically been, as a team, going through any documentation that exists around safe learning environments, and preparing a literature review to try to see what's out there in terms of evidence for what works and what doesn't, and actually trying to put it into a more defined categorization of what safe learning environments are, because it's so broad. And so that's what this Q2 conceptual mapping is. So I'll show you the slide, and I might as well just skip forward to it. So this is what it looks like. All right, it's a bit busy, but that's the point. It's an extremely complex topic, and we don't want to just talk about safe learning environments as one thing, as if it's a thing that you can measure, have one indicator for, and say, all right, it's safe, good. So here's what we've mapped out. The 3 major categorizations that we've identified are environmental threats, which includes natural disasters and health emergencies. There's internal threats from within school by teachers and staff and student peers, so this is things like school-related gender-based violence, which includes bullying, corporal punishment, sexual abuse, physical abuse. And then finally, external threats, which is also called education under attack in some cases, but this is things like recruitment into a group, whether it be a gang or an armed group, ideological attacks, individual attacks to and from school, so maybe just violence in the area, and then caught in the crossfire. And then on the very right, these are the types of interventions that we've found in this review of literature that's available that tend to be those that address. We're not necessarily saying which one works, which one doesn't, but at this point what we're doing as a team is breaking out each of these categories to try to produce the evidence that we have about this particular intervention. And exactly what Nina said, which is what do we mean evidence? And that's what we're figuring out. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, if you want to call it that. There's a lot of qualitative assessments of this program, and everybody says it's great, but is that good enough for us to say that this is something we should replicate? More than that, is this something that works in this environment and will therefore work in another environment? So, I mean, it's a lot of work. So what we're doing, with this, I'll get away from that. So, I mean, the lines are everywhere. I mean, it's busy. So what we're doing, and we can't do this ourselves just within the support team. I mean, we're doing the busy work of producing the categorizations and creating a conversation piece, which we're going to take to a workshop, which is going to happen at the end of July, and we're going to invite the experts in the field. I'm not an expert in this field, but there's many people who have worked on this for many years, whether they be academic, whether they be practitioners. But they're the ones that are going to come and have a look at this graphic and the briefs that we've produced and the evidence that we've actually put together and say, you're missing this, you need to add this is good evidence, this isn't. And so we're going to have a workshop around this particular topic. And with that, what we want to do eventually, and this is Q3 and Q4, is finalize these reference documents and circulate them to the community of practice. Eventually we want to identify indicators on safety. And again, we don't mean one indicator on safety. We mean what is this program, where is it, and what are the indicators we should be using. And then finally generate a discussion with the community of practice, what additional field research and studies would be most useful to conduct going forward. And we'll talk more about this with our year 2 activities, because of course if there's a major data gap in evidence, then that might be where we prioritize our resources to learn more. I'm going to skip through all this and we'll have time to talk about each of these activities in a moment. So activity 2.2, Mark Summers is leading this, so I'll present on his behalf. But what he's doing is a specific case study on alternative education programs in the DRC. And he conducted a number of key informant interviews, which led to a discussion document that he shared with a group of experts in the field of DRC. And then he had a workshop, which was basically to have them be his research advisors, and it was he developed hypotheses, and the group had to discuss what are the research questions that you should be looking into. And it was a really sort of fun, interactive, people called in from elsewhere, and really informed the research design that he's putting together so that he can go out and do this research and ask the questions that people do agree are the ones that need to be answered. And so he's going to go into the field in the fall for a few weeks, and it's the first step of this broader case study that we're learning about. And the key issues that he's looking into are, like we addressed before, who's getting targeted for these programs, are they the right people? And then also, how are these alternative education programs, in specific the accelerated learning programs, how are they affecting the formal education program if you have the option of free education faster? So these are the issues that he's going to be looking at, and he'll produce a discussion document to share with the group. Again, this is the part where building evidence. Here's one very, very small piece. And so it could be an example of how we're going to do research in the future. And we want to talk more about that, especially around the research consultations that we have, the future directions, how do we decide that. So this is kind of a case study in DRC, but also in how we're going to do this as a group at ECCN. And then finally is the research knowledge share group. This is very small right now. It's going to gain momentum as soon as we decide on topics to focus on, but basically what this is going to be is a way for, and everyone says this, but it's going to happen, research and practitioners to communicate. It's going to be not just online discussions, but it's going to be a network where, and this will feed into what Bettina was talking about, who is let in to this network, who counts as being a vetted researcher in the ECCN, so that we can not just share knowledge that we have, but also talk about research going forward. So maybe an implementing partner believes there needs to be more work about this. They know the existing research that's published, but maybe there's a researcher working on this right now in the field, a grad student, for example. And that research can be sort of influenced by the implementing partner's needs. The benefit for the graduate student is, okay, this research will get used, and so I can refine my research questions in this way so that it actually becomes something tangible. So that's going to be one, how this will work. Welcome your opinion about how we get people to actually start this conversation. And one way to do this is to form thematic breakout groups, which was recommended to me in a number of key informant interviews, which is that we're not just talking about research generally, but we're talking about specific issues. And so safe learning environments will probably be one, just because there's a lot of interest. And so we'll focus on that theme as a group, and then have these conversations about what research needs to be done going forward, what are the indicators we need to use, and so on. What we're also going to do is be building an online repository of existing field research. So this is part of the broader document library that we'll have at ECCN website. But this is going to be published research and gray literature that maybe isn't out there, but it's going to be vetted by the research knowledge share group. This is a process, again, we haven't decided yet what makes it as evidence, what makes it as good research. But basically, we want somewhere where a person can go to the ECCN website and say, this is good research, it's been vetted by the experts, and so I'm going to really use this. And then finally, this is going to be probably the most important that we get on quickly, which is to prepare these must-see research briefs. One thing that comes from a lot of people is that we just don't have time or necessarily even access to read these journal articles, which are 20 pages long and they're dense and there's all this theory. We want to know, what do we need to know from this? Make it easy, make it simple. So we're going to produce these must-see research briefs. And again, this is going to be things that are vetted with the community and hopefully all of us here as not just important, but very specific in terms of, consider this in your research design with regard to making this learning environment safer in this context. And we see this as being a way to get more interest in the knowledge share group, also to get more members and to grow it. And so it's this evolving process. But this is where we are now. At this point, the database is simply on my computer of potential people who are going to be members, and I will invite them to join as soon as we get the website up and running and as soon as we decide on topics. But right now, it's kind of all in theory. So would invite all of your recommendations for this. Now, possible year 2 activities, I've alluded to these, and again, we'll talk about these tomorrow. But with safer learning environments, it's going to be filling these research gaps or filling these data gaps with more research. And also regional workshops on the safer learning environments, indicators, and M&E toolkits when they're developed, of course. Activity 2.2 is expanding the work on AEPs in DRC to other contexts. So this is just broader corpus of knowledge of these data gaps that have been identified by experts. And then also potentially putting together field research toolkits to use in planning, specifically in AEP intervention. So what questions need to be asked before anything is done, for example. And then finally with the research KSG, we want to get monthly research briefs. We'll keep people engaged. There's so much research out there, you know, let's push it out and make it accessible. We would love to do some podcasts and webinars and blog posts and TED Talk sort of stuff to make, you know, someone has 15 minutes, they listen to one of our experts who says, yeah, I'll offer, you know, the latest tidbits from the research I'm doing right now. Mark Summers, for example, will be blogging potentially from DRC when he's doing this work, and we hope it'll be something that people want to listen to and it's interesting. And then finally, linking field researchers with grants to conduct primary research identified as most needed by practitioners. I mean, there's a lot of good resources out there in the form of very good graduate students out in the field willing to do excellent research. And so we want to take advantage of those. And then also, you know, research consultants and those with expertise. So there's one big discussion question, which is how might IPs use or contribute to field research, especially when this research may show evidence contradicting key assumptions in the project. So that's the thing about, you know, solid research is it makes things really complicated. And so this is the big question that we have is, how can this actually work? It sounds good in theory, but how can we do it? So with that, we can either talk about this or any of the specific activities.
And this is actually your opportunity to talk.
Yeah, between each other, like it's, and the camera can focus elsewhere.
We can kind of get lulled into listening mode, but we hope to have, you know, 10 minutes of opportunity to really interact.
How do we define the field? Is it the teacher in the classroom? Is it the chief of party on the project?
That's a really good question. Yeah, that's something we should obviously discuss as a group. I mean, when I was doing interviews with people who say we need more field research, it was specifically directed at the people who are getting this program, or the potential beneficiaries, along with those who are delivering that program. So for example, what is the capacity of delivering this program to those people who are going to be receiving this program? So it's, you know, maybe too vaguely where it's going to be happening versus only literature that existed in a context that was different as being.
Sorry, that answer confused me a little bit.
So field research being on the ground where the program's going to happen, basically.
Okay.
Is that clear?
I think so. Let's keep going.
And just to put my 2 cents in about the field and me coming from an operational NGO and coming from, you know, people who do implement these programs. I mean, I very much would be for, I mean, getting the research from the actual implementing partners and, you know, seeing how our programs are benefiting affected populations, but also, you know, how we're interacting with the local governments, how we're working with the national governments, you know, how we're working with other partners, who's doing what. I mean, I feel like there seems to be in this, I mean, and a major concern is, you know, this seems very, very academic at times, for lack of a official term. But then how do we, you know, how does my organization or Mercy Corps, FHI, how do we take that and make it into a kind of a practical program? I mean, I don't think when we're developing, you know, our education programs, again, I will qualify, but I am not the education officer, but have been part of some of the development of our programs. You know, we're not necessarily pulling from all of these academic papers and stuff. We're pulling from what has worked before, what is the context, what are the needs, what environment are we operating in? Are we even able to do formal education? Or, you know, a lot of times it is that informal alternative type of education. I mean, those are the types of things that we're pulling from versus kind of, you know, the different research papers. I think they serve as a nice framework, and especially as we're getting larger programs off the ground, we might do a literature review, but I mean, really it comes from the experiences and the practices that, you know, we've had before and what other organizations have had before as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Sure, and that's, yeah, go ahead.
So now I was going to say, for these 2 days, what you're saying, I really agree with it, but the utility of the support team and the ECCN is to get just to that, which is you've got a strong research arm, and how do we link that through to developing tools and products. So it's the whole circle of taking it in, taking it up from you, synthesizing and analyzing and bringing it back down. And so as we go through to Objective 4, then I'll talk about how over the next few years do we optimize that within the ECCN.
And I think it's also just, this is an important point actually, because what we are seeing in USAID in this particular line of work is that we lack rigor that tells us that what your intuition is telling you that this worked before. You know, we need more evidence in order to invest $100 million in that, right? And so we want to bring these things together that actually say, you know, what we usually see are case studies and a lot of sort of intuitive why this worked, but we want to actually, we do want to do more impact evaluations. We do want to invest in the counterfactual research that would, along with the qualitative black box, you know, what was it about this intervention that was successful? But we feel like we've come to a point now, and I think that the baseline helped, you know, really sort of illuminated this, is that we lack some of that evidence that tells us that we should be making these investments to scale.
At some point, I'd love to, and maybe this is answering the question about evidence. What is an example of a proof of some concept that USAID and we feel comfortable with to build something up? But maybe that's another discussion.
Yeah, and it's a discussion certainly for the knowledge share group, but perhaps it should be much broader than that. I mean, because yeah, we can have the RCT versus qualitative ethnography, you know, all day, but where do we draw the line?
Just from a practitioner point of view, just being in the field and dealing with programs, oftentimes I find that the research is so confined by time and resources, and you get individuals on the ground with the best of intentions, but they have to narrow the question so much in order to fit what they need to in a limited amount of time with the limited resources, and therefore skewing the eventual outcomes because they're not able to look at what we know are all the complex and contributing variables. And I must admit, one of the most exciting research projects that I've ever been involved with was on an Afghanistan project in the early days when USAID actually invested $1.5 million worth of M&E and research into a project expansion, so that allowed for longitudinal studies as well as the basic monitoring and evaluation to follow track of kids. Now, wouldn't it be more exciting if you could go back and follow them even after the program? But really thinking about that throughout a lifetime project, resources to do rigorous research, and then also following up with separate funds later under whatever mechanism to track students, because the real impact's after a project, and having that follow on.
Just a couple of observations. I think one of the things that constrains or affects this whole thing is the fact that typically projects do not contain resources or legitimacy for doing the kind of in-depth research and follow-through that we're talking about. They provide the funds for doing monitoring and evaluation, but that doesn't actually answer these questions. And either through kind of a community of practice, information onto the mechanisms within USAID which designs programs to put more emphasis into research. I mean, in this field, particularly in Goal 3, which is so complex and challenging, you would expect that at least 10 to 15% of the total level of effort would be on research and analysis. That's what any private sector work would do. But it's not. And so that's one part of it, but it's not only that we would seek USAID funding through a project, there are other sources. And I think maybe this group could be kind of imaginative in thinking about what it would take to actually move forward coherently on this in terms of what really makes sense for practitioners in the field. And we're a long way from that. So just an observation. I mean, it's something that we've heard quite a lot too, but it's a big challenge.
I have a question about just practically how this group can be used to do exactly what you're saying, do better research as part of the project, right? Or, for example, if we're going to support an applied research project, then how can we use the resources here to ensure that it's on the right track? Or just to sort of be a cross-check in terms of whether they're using rigorous enough methods or asking some important question or not doing research that's already kind of been proven. Have you guys thought through practically how the network can be used for that purpose?
I mean, it's all in theory at this point, but I mean, the idea is that anything that is done through ECCN in terms of research would be vetted by the group.
But what if it's not done through ECCN?
Yeah. Okay, so like using other research, for example.
Like, what if we have my bureau, we're gonna support an applied research project in non-formal education. And a lot of the groups applying for it are implementing partners who don't necessarily have depth in terms of applied research. They know a lot about what's going on the ground in their programs, but I'm finding that, maybe like if there was some way to
Kind of like quality assurance.
Yeah.
We have an IRB board that
Yeah.
looks at our projects, but we're really struggling because they're not familiar with conducting, it's for monitoring and evaluation, that's researching. But they're having a hard time understanding the realities of collecting information in a very unstable context, and then quality and rigor, and particularly having to do with like informed consent and branding, and just there are all sorts of issues that it would be awesome to have some guidelines from like ECCN, like when you're planning a evaluation, these are some things to keep in mind, because like our IRB's not so far been helpful in trying to find something that works, and it kind of balances between we're doing good research, we're ensuring that people aren't hurt by what we're doing, and but I think it's a great opportunity for like kind of problem solving and how do you get information that's going to be helping plan good projects.
Sure.
But something else I'm hearing Christine is talking about is the need for collaboration across different bureaus or different agencies to make sure you're building up instead of replicating. I mean, then you're diluting the whole field itself, right? If you want to really create a good active agenda on this, advocacy agenda and policy agenda, you need to build on what exists. So, and actively understanding what else is happening and being able to collaborate for funding and programming support. I think so that would require another level of knowledge gathering and sharing that helps us make better decisions on this.
And it's sort of what we have in mind around the school safety or safe learning environments consultation with all the experts in the room, is we're hoping to sort of get everyone's input on what exists, what's out there, and make sure that we're not eventually going to replicate something that's already been done or something that's generally agreed upon as a promising practice in terms of the interventions. But that's helpful.
Well, what's interesting to me, I think, about Sajid's comment is that it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing thing. And Ash will talk about this in a different way with regard to feedback loops. So how do we continually refresh what we do in a way that's not just going to make more work for everybody? I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
And part of this goes to our site itself. If it's closed and stripped, then we are limiting the potential for us to learn. And we have to think about open versus closed in a sense of the life of this project beyond just the life of this mandate itself. If it's a learning community, the more we close communities,
Yeah.
sorry, but that's, we are limiting the ability to learn and grow this field.
I think Chris brought up a really important point that we need to think about and reflect on, because I do think that we have some resources and expertise within ECCN that can benefit the agency broadly, more broadly. And I think that that's something we should put a placeholder on and talk. I mean, it might seem like a more internal USAID issue, but it is something that we'd like to be able to sort of reach across. And if, we do have other research initiatives in the bureaus too, and so how does ECCN interact with those initiatives? And I do think that quality assurance is actually really, it's non-trivial actually. I mean, yeah.
At the moment, quality assurance in terms of high quality is very much defined because of the policy on evaluation by impact evaluations, which has certain parameters which don't particularly fit the context of Goal 3, in which you make assumptions about the stability of an intervention and the stability of the environment. Neither of those hold particularly. So that the conditions under which you can carry out a gold-plated RCT very seldom apply. So then we need guidelines to how to do rigor and quality, but not be constrained by the parameters that are currently defined by the RCTs and the impact evaluation. I think this is a very important agenda for the group, because otherwise we're kind of hamstrung by the legitimacy and funding that goes into impact evaluations under conditions where they don't apply, or where it's very difficult for them to apply. So
I actually see it as an opportunity for us, because if we can help to define an alternative that we feel, it presents rigor and there's thought in the approach, I think we can make a contribution, really. Where right now there's sort of a vacuum.
Maybe I can just put on my USAID hat with, I would say, instead of couching it as an alternative, some complementary, because we're not going to change the evaluation policy, but I think what we can do is add to what exists in a way that is more realistic.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I've been thinking this morning, and even before coming, what is it that can help the ECCN differentiate itself? And Chloe's very first question of, well, how are we different than INEE speaks right to that. And differentiation is not a hollow term, and it's not meant to be superficial when we say, how do we create a buzz behind ECCN? People say, this is a group that's really adding value in new ways. Okay, it's not a duplication of, it's worth my time. And there are three ways. I'll come to research since that's the topic on the table. One is obviously content, and we've talked about that. Another is the process, and I thought that you raised some really interesting points about the ideas about process and how do we use this, and who do we really want to reach in order for people to say, yes, this is the group that I need to spend my not enough time on. Okay, so coming to the research, there are a couple of things that come to mind. The first is, what is the critical path for impact? Now, I'm not talking about impact evaluations, because those are bound by a certain level of funding and a certain set of activities. I'm talking about how in organizations, whether they're local NGOs or they're aid or they're the implementing partners that many of us are part of, what is the best role that ECCN can play to increase the flow of resources, increase the introduction of new ideas into organizations that are involved all along the delivery chain, okay? And so we tend to make the assumption that the first workshop should be in northern Nigeria, okay, with groups that are actually doing things. I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. I don't have a dog in the hunt here, okay. But maybe a better use of the resources we have is to meet with headquarters staff or boards of directors of implementing partners. Because if they really get excited, they might find they'll perhaps demand changes in the way things are being done in their organizations, make sure resources are available. So I don't know the answer. I'm just saying, as practitioners and all of us who care so much about this, we make the assumption that you got to go to the field first because that's where you're really going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And again, I'm not doubting that. Just saying one piece of research may be to step back from the impact evaluation, which is bound by a project, and say, in our field, what activities actually create the greatest impact? Okay. And I don't think we understand that. The second area that strikes me on this research is we've all been frustrated for decades by the 5-year life of a project. And the project ends and there's no way to track as time goes on what really happened. And I thought maybe we might want to look at using some of these grants we have to fund that, to fund organizations in the field, local, probably local NGOs, maybe even government units, whatever, to stick with the beneficiaries over time, 5 years after the end of the life of the project, to see what actually was sustained, and to provide that kind of ongoing sustainability thinking. Because otherwise we all deal with projects over, people leave, and there's no ongoing group that's charged with trying to figure out whether this really made sense over time.
Yeah.
So those are 2 research.
That's great, thanks.
Yeah, those are helpful. Thank you. Seems like we've come to a resting place on agenda 2.
But just
brought the
one
conversation.
No,
observation.
no, they were great.
Yeah, that's perfect.
There's enthusiasm and focus on alternative education programs and accelerated learning programs. And I really like the suggestion. It would be really helpful to do some follow-ups of those that have existed, and there are many. And because at the moment there's some policy problematics around them about sustainability, about integration, and since in most cases under USAID funded programs and others, these become new initiatives. They are providing a context and an environment and an experience for beneficiaries, youth often, who otherwise don't have any education. But then what? In terms of its continued existence as a parallel part of the system, integrated into it, so forth. And one of the things that's really striking to me is how little we know about those programs after the funding stops, after the project ends. And yet, we're going to put there already is a lot of effort into them. So let's take a look at what's out there in terms of when the project is over. I think it's really important. Something is missing.
So what that brings to mind for me is this word that we hear so often, but how often do we actually really go deeper into it? This word of sustainability, right? It's become one of those throwaway words that we say, but really don't follow through with. And of course, there are many different ways. So what do you want to sustain, right? And I think this is, and I've heard people say, more on the emergency side, we're not here to sustain anything. You know, we're here to do what we have to do. This is an acute situation. That's what we're going to focus on. I think we right here are in sort of a slightly different place, right? We're in that transitional place where we need to begin to consider that what we do, even in emergencies, lays foundations or seeds or creates pathways for better and for worse that then continue on. And understood we can't always overcomplicate everything. When you're in an emergency, you deal with that emergency. But somebody, maybe ECCN, can begin to reflect a little bit on what does sustainability mean in these contexts. Some things do have systemic implications because we hope that there will be systems if there aren't. Right? Some might not be the systemic piece, it might be different subcomponents of a program, figuring out who is going to carry that if not the system. Or is that okay if this piece goes away? But what about the beneficiaries? Is there something sustaining whatever a next phase is of what our work was with those individuals or those communities or those regions? It's not something we talk about nearly enough.
And I would just say as well, the whole sustainability conversation is very pregnant with conflict sensitivity concerns, because it, again, it is resources. And taking the humanitarian example, which is close to my heart, you are coming into a resource scarce environment, you're injecting resources, and you can have all sorts of political economy and conflict factor knock-on effects down the line, and it's very, very important, not just from action perspectives.
Just one thing on sustainability, I mean, especially again in the emergency context, I mean, you go into the emergency context and then it evolves into that kind of protracted context. So again, it's, you know, there's kind of debates around sustainability. If you know these people aren't going back to their homes anytime soon, you know, how do you make those decisions to make them more long-term, to be filling a gap, especially, you know, I'm thinking specifically in the Syria context. I mean, and Lebanon specifically, you know, it's, you know, very, you know, informal education. I mean, how do you make it, and they're going to be there for a while. So like, how do you make it? Do you make it sustainable? How do you integrate it? I mean, there's just so many questions around it, and maybe that's something that this group can, you know, not say, but like it's just something to keep in mind when you talk about sustainability. It's emergency versus protracted versus development.
Well, I think one contribution that we can make, of course, we're not going to be able to address all the topics and solve all the problems, but I think if we can put some thought into teasing out a little bit of the different considerations and provide reflection, question, and I don't mean this in a superficial way, because I don't mean it in a throwaway sense, but you know, when you're so if you're in a situation like the one you described, what are the kinds of factors that you need to consider early on?
Right.
What are the implications of what you're doing? No one's going to be able to make that decision in the abstract. So you're going to have to take those questions, apply them to the context in which you're working, work with as many other stakeholders as you can and make the most informed decision. But if we collectively can provide some guidance in that,
Right.
I think that might be helpful.
I think it's important to go back to one of your original questions, though, what is to be sustained? I know we often enter these programs with a predetermined set of notions of what should be sustained, though through working with the beneficiaries, the governments, whatever, you realize that they really want and need something quite different. And so thinking about sustainability from a different lens, and what are those aspects to be sustained versus just a continued replication of what we tried to introduce. And something in this discussion also brought up a quandary that we often have now with the emergency environments, trying to meet targets. Well, you have folks going home, which is a really good thing. And if I read one more report that talks about our challenges because our numbers are dropping from our program, but they're going home, which is like, I mean, there's some really interesting...
Yeah, absurdity of it.
So...
Well, and hopefully we'll get to this more with this emergent thing, and maybe I will close this conversation. Let us all have a coffee break and tea break.